Welcome to KU Parashala. My name is Chad A. Haag. I am an author and former teacher from the United States of America, and I'm very excited to have the opportunity today to discuss with you the history of Western philosophy. In this fifth and final lecture, we will examine the 20th century German philosophy of phenomenology through the figures of Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, and Hans Georg Gadamer. Now, before we get to the very different way the phenomenology was done in its properly hermeneutical phase with Gadamer and even with Heidegger, we will first examine the origins of phenomenology through its founder, Edmund Husserl's understanding of it as proposed within his work, The Ideas. Now, in that book, Husserl made the very bold statement that phenomenology is to psychology what geometry is to natural science. Now, if we think about that for a moment, it's clear that both geometry and natural science are studying spatial objects, but they're doing so in radically different ways. Natural science examines spatial objects as real entities which are observed with the five senses as physical objects which can only be approached through empirical means. Geometry, in contrast, studies spatial objects, but it does so in a way that is purified, a way that is eternally valid, a way that is a priori or known independent of experience. Therefore, the geometrical account of a circle is going to be radically different from the scientific account, or rather, in more mundane terms, just the observation of a circular object as you see it in the real world. Similarly, for phenomenology and psychology, they are both studying consciousness, but whereas psychology studies consciousness through empirical observations of a particular physical object, of course the brain, phenomenology has a radically different methodology of studying consciousness, instead giving you transcendentally purified essences with regard to consciousness in much the same way that geometry gives you the transcendentally purified circle, the perfect square, the perfect equilateral triangle, which of course don't really exist in the real world, for no matter how close you might get to the ideal of that for which every point is equidistant from the center, that can only really understand as such a purified essence rather than a physical object. Of course, when applied to consciousness rather than spatial objects, understanding how this could work is actually far more difficult and far more unclear. Husserl noted really that one can only study consciousness phenomenologically if one adopts a radically different methodology. We take for granted, of course, that the same general scientific method can be applied to pretty much any field of knowledge in order to reliably yield results and get you closer and closer to the truth. But that method really does not work for the phenomenological study of consciousness, because the presupposition at work in the background is what Husserl calls the natural attitude. Natural attitude really is just the idea, the common sense one, that the person having the experiences is a body situated in space within a world populated by so many other bodies, and that one is caught up in a moment in time in which, even after the act of observation is finished, all of those other things will continue existing within time even after, I'm saying, not paying attention to them. That is perfectly legitimate and really should be used by the natural sciences. It is not that they too should get rid of it, but simply something which causes more problems if applied to phenomenology. For ironically enough, the natural attitude will prevent you from seeing what appears within consciousness even though it's already there, much like the Purloined Letter of Edgar Allan Poe, which nobody can find precisely because it's exactly where it's supposed to be, out in the open. They're looking everywhere except there. It's like that with understanding consciousness. He argued that if you suspend the natural attitude, that is to say, you simply don't use it, you can examine what is already there within consciousness without any metaphysical prejudices, that is to say, any presuppositions about that content which has to conform to some other understanding of the definition of being qua being, which you had inappropriately smuggled into the investigation. One of the things you will be freed up to do if you have such a suspension of the natural attitude is to clarify the distinction between formal ontology and material ontology. Ontology is, of course, the study of being, but something which Husserl noted has a radically different sense when considered formally rather than materially. To put it in a very brief form, formal ontology simply studies the logical categories such as property, whole and part, relation, identity, collection, genus, and species, which will, in a certain sense, be used to understand any anonymous object whatsoever. In other words, the rules of thinking about objects will actually be kind of consistent formally, regardless of what kind of object one is dealing with. This is why, for Kant, the transcendental object, which is at work in using transcendental logic, is one which one cannot help but think of even if it's totally devoid of content. Husserl similarly proposed a formal ontology but qualified his philosophy by also adding in concerns for the material ontology, in which the kind of being which one is examining will ultimately have to come from a particular region of being, to use his own metaphor. This is a set of non-overlapping types of objects which are differentiated from one another simply on the basis of their essential characteristics. For example, any object of a physical variety which you examine, such as this coffee mug, will inevitably appear within consciousness itself in a series of partial profiles. You never see the whole object all at once because you only ever see one side of it at a time. That is not a negative thing, for that is precisely what characterizes a physical object. If you were to take a book or a laptop or any other object, it would have the same rules. And we know that because within consciousness itself, if we don't get caught up in metaphysical pseudo-problems, we can examine the way that all of these physical objects are appearing within consciousness with a certain consistency with one another. That is not, however, how other types of objects appear within consciousness. Laws, for example, are not manifested that way. Psychic acts themselves are not manifested that way. Husserl's own example of feelings do not manifest themselves within a series of partial profiles, for those are different types of things. He argued that there is no ultimate genus under which all of these regions fall, for they are more like a set of disconnected peaks than the branches of a single tree with one common trunk. Heidegger went beyond Husserl, though still considering himself a phenomenologist and being really the most famous of all of Husserl's students, by arguing that even this was not going far enough in the direction of reawakening the question of being. Now, obviously, Husserl gave us something like a revision of the very term ontology by separating material and formal varieties thereof. But Heidegger argued that the question of being was still something which could not be reawakened to the full extent because of a misunderstanding between the word being and the idea of beings in the plural. Beings are things which can be submitted to categorical analysis, as we find with the 10 categories of Aristotle, and of course in the Middle Ages also with Abu Nasr al-Farabi, Thomas Aquinas, etc. Beings can be submitted to the formal ontology, in which you study how objects appear regardless of their type, or it could be considered even in a certain sense to be a general genus under which all of those beings are falling, no matter what they might be. In contrast with beings, which are basically, physical things or really just any kind of things which can manifest themselves, being is, for Heidegger, really more like disclosure. He used the metaphor of a clearing in the woods, in which there's a certain manifestation, a certain revelation, okay? And not just the set of things in the clearing, but the clearing in the woods itself as a metaphor for what being, as Dasein, the German term being there, really was. And for this reason, you have to make this an explicitly hermeneutical concern, in that Dasein really is something more like a horizon of interpretation rather than a physical object. This really goes back to his distinction between the ontic and the ontological. The ontic maybe is a way of dealing with the physical realm, factual existence, mere thinghood, etc. But ontology, as a study of being qua being, is a question which really has not been posed since the ancient Greek era. This is ironic because Dasein is precisely that for which a relation to the question of being is a concern about its own being. For this reason, ontology is not a study of any particular entity in its thinghood, but is instead Dasein's ability to question its own being. Heidegger argued that this question really cannot be raised anymore in his era within the 20th century because of a misunderstanding of something that is actually just a historically transmitted answer given by the ancient Greeks over time, mistaking that for an answer which is simply self-evident and therefore not a real question at all. But he noted that what we take for granted as being is really just the properly temporal definition of presence. And this is something which is not at all self-evident, but was handed to us from thinkers like Plato, who understood it particularly through the world of forms, or Aristotle, who understood that type of being as presence through substance, Thomas Aquinas, who understood it through the pure actuality ultimately of God, Hegel, who understood it as absolute notion, Nietzsche, who understood it as the will to power. But really, all of this emphasis on presence had failed to really question what time itself is. Being had occupied the ancient Greeks, especially in the pre-Socratic era, before this sort of tradition had been finalized into the form that we take for granted, but he notes that it has ceased to be a real topic of investigation for anyone who even bothers to ask the question is assumed to be guilty of a methodological error. This is, however, something which takes for granted a specifically temporal interpretation of presence which disregards the irony that Dasein, as disclosure to itself, with a self-understanding in terms of its own, the possibilities to which it had been thrown, is, in a certain sense, time. The title Being and Time is really kind of something of an answer to this mysterious question of being. Now, by Gadamer in the mid-20th century, this emphasis on interpretation and horizons of meaning had actually been radicalized through the linguistic turn. Gadamer wrote his magnum opus, Truth and Method, as something of a response to the problem of academic philosophy and really all of the liberal arts, human sciences, etc., within the university that had resulted, ironically enough, from Kant's own theory of aesthetics. In short, by the mid-20th century, philosophers had simply accepted that there is no truth except that of scientific description, and there is no method except that of scientific research. Some of the human sciences reacted to this by simply borrowing the scientific method and using it regardless of whether it was fully appropriate to do so in all contexts, while other departments like, say, the classics sometimes accepted their own lack of truth and lack of method. You have professors to this day in the United States say things like, well, poets don't really lie because they don't tell the truth either, because in poetry there is no truth value because we're not using language in that way. We're not talking about things, we're not using a method, we're simply saying pretty things with words. This was something which, ironically enough, had followed precisely from Kant's radical overemphasis on art as a purely subjective experience, which is not mediated by any universal concept. As we noted in the third lecture, for Kant, you have great art like, say, Mozart, Cervantes, and Van Gogh precisely because you don't understand. And because there is no concept to tell you what that work of art is, your subjective faculties can launch into a harmonious and pleasurable free play. Well, ironically enough, it was precisely that which led to this sorry state of affairs in which truth and method are both only owned by the sciences. Gadamer argued, however, that the kind of truth disclosed in art might not be scientific truth, but it is still truth. It is just truth of a properly hermeneutical variety. One does not view things in art purely objectively, for that would imply that anything like a simple mirroring of what's in front of one is possible, and also that the organism's reaction to a given stimulus is enough to account for what happens within not just, say, perception, but understanding of a person situated within a horizon of meaning. In contrast, he argued that one only ever interprets through the hermeneutical circle in which one can only even begin the process of understanding the part, if one already has some understanding of the whole, however vague that might be. And for this reason, we have to shift our emphasis from the objectivity of the sciences to, instead, the strange position that language has, which is neither objective nor subjective. He noted that hermeneutical interpretation occurs within a horizon of meaning which is neither purely subjective. For if that were the case, the interpretation of the classics would literally mean that one was restoring a carbon copy of what happened on the inside of the author's mind when he or she wrote the text. In this case, understanding Don Quixote is nothing more than reconstructing the exact same mental processes that Cervantes himself had when he wrote the book. We all know that that's not what interpreting the classics really is. But on the other hand, it's not purely objective either, for once again, that would assume that one could simply mirror what is there in front of one as a matter of an organism reacting to a stimulus in its environment. In contrast, hermeneutical interpretation occurs within a horizon of meaning which is neither totally subjective nor totally objective, because it is the realm of language. He noted that even though not every single thing offered up to interpretation is explicitly linguistic, there is still something of a teleological orientation towards language which, say, painting, sculpture, architecture, etc. have, even if they cannot literally actualize that orientation towards language in reality. He gave the example also of a set of stone monuments from some forgotten civilization in the vastly distant past. If they were just discovered one day, the stone monuments certainly would be fascinating to look at, and one might even be tempted to try to imagine the world of the people who created them. But in the absence of written texts, their world would remain totally inaccessible to us, because no matter how many stone monuments we might have, in the absence of this fusion of horizons on a properly linguistic level, that world remains totally inaccessible to us, precisely because understanding really is language. And it's quite interesting that phenomenology went from the ultimately mathematical concerns of Husserl, as somebody who was initially writing the philosophy of arithmetic to understand how we can know things about numbers if they don't, if they are not literally physical objects. It went from that sort of mathematical discipline to one explicitly just focused on language and the classics and interpretation. But properly understood, I think it is simply inevitable that phenomenology ended in that place. So this will conclude the final video in our series on the history of Western philosophy. I thank you once again for this wonderful opportunity to have this discussion with you, and I thank the university and everybody who helped make this video series possible.